You hear it absolutely everywhere lately, right? Fascist, fascism. It's thrown around constantly in the news, all over social media, in political debates. Sometimes you even hear it used as just a generic insult for a boss who's being a bit too controlling. But okay, I have a confession to make. When a word gets used that broadly, it kind of starts to lose its actual meaning. We know it conjures up these horrific images of World War II and terrible atrocities. But what is its actual, objective, historical source code? Like, where did this movement literally begin, and what are its undeniable historical ingredients?
Well, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to do something really important. We are going to completely de-weaponize this highly charged buzzword. We're not here to throw labels around or point fingers, no way. Instead, we're going to look purely at the historical facts to understand what fascism actually was when it was born. By pulling directly from deep historical scholarship and expert analysis, we want to arm you with the clarity you need to evaluate the modern world for yourself.
To keep us on track, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll hit the definition problem, then Mussolini's blueprint, followed by Hitler's escalation, the fascist playbook, and finally, the modern debate.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The definition problem.
To really understand this, we have to travel back to the sheer misery of Europe right after World War I. People were desperately looking for radical fixes. Societies were quite literally ripped apart by absolute carnage. So in the spring of 1919, in Milan, Italy, an angry veteran named Benito Mussolini started a combat club. Now he needed a symbol for his new nationalist movement, so he actually reached back to ancient Rome and adopted the fascio. It's a bundle of sticks bound together. The idea is, a single stick is easily broken, right? But a bundled group? Indestructible. Add an axe to it, and you've got a tool of ultimate punishment. Mussolini was basically telling his followers that Italians needed to become this unified bundle, a fascio, fascismo, fascism. So it didn't start as some grand, complex philosophy. Actually, it started as the branding for a violent anti-communist combat club made up of angry war veterans.
Which brings us to Section 2, Mussolini's blueprint.
So, you might be wondering, how does a fringe club of thugs actually manage to take over an entire democratic country? Well, it happened incredibly fast. Mussolini's group, known as the Black Shirts, glorified violence, specifically against socialists and communists. They'd physically attack strikes, literally burn down newspaper offices, the whole shebang. But here is the absolutely crucial detail. The Italian democratic government was weak, and wealthy business elites were terrified, and I mean terrified, of communist revolutions taking their wealth. So they actually started funding Mussolini's violent thugs to crush the working class protests. By 1922, Mussolini had tens of thousands of armed men marching on Rome. The King of Italy, who desperately wanted to avoid a civil war and knew his own army kind of sympathized with the fascists, just handed Mussolini the role of prime minister. He didn't conquer the democracy by force alone, he was invited in. And by 1925, he had abolished freedom of the press, opposing parties, and eventually elections altogether.
Now let's shift gears. Section 3. Hitler's escalation.
Meanwhile, over in Germany, there was another angry World War I veteran taking very careful notes on Mussolini's success. And Germany was in a significantly worse state than Italy at the time. They were dealing with a humiliated military, immense war debt, and literally wheelbarrows full of worthless cash because of hyperinflation. Adolf Hitler joined a fringe nationalist group and formed his own militia, the Brown Shirts. In 1923, trying to straight up copy Mussolini's March on Rome, Hitler attempted a violent coup in a Munich beer hall, and it was a massive failure. He was arrested and thrown in jail. But that failure actually forced him to rethink his entire strategy.
Now, what's really interesting about this strategic pivot he made while sitting in that jail cell is that Hitler realized brute force alone just wasn't going to cut it. He couldn't just jump straight to dictatorship. Instead, he wrote out a blueprint that essentially said, look, we have to gain mainstream elite acceptance, use the democratic system to win elections, and only then, once we legally hold the levers of power, can we destroy democracy from within.
When the Great Depression hit in 1929, millions of desperate, out-of-work Germans were primed for Hitler's message. But Hitler weaponized that historical blueprint by adding some deeply, deeply toxic elements. Fake science regarding an imagined pure Aryan master race, and a total obsession with blood and soil. He provided a really simple but deadly scapegoat for all of Germany's economic ruin. He blamed a totally fabricated international conspiracy led by Jewish people and communists. And just like in Italy, conservative business elites and politicians, who were terrified of communism, invited Hitler in. They made him chancellor in 1933, thinking, they could control him. Big mistake. Within months, using a manufactured state of emergency, he suspended the Constitution and set the stage for the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II.
Let's synthesize this. Section 4, the fascist playbook. If we step back from the terrifying history of these two regimes, what's the actual objective core we can extract? Scholars have identified a sort of checklist, the historical source code, if you will. First, these movements glorify violence against political enemies. Second, they invoke a fake, mythologized, pure past that has supposedly been stolen from them. Third, they promise a national rebirth that relies entirely on one charismatic leader. Fourth, and this is absolutely vital, they gain acceptance from mainstream elites who mistakenly think they can use them. Fifth, they use democratic mechanisms to attain power only to dismantle that democracy from the inside. And finally, they demand total societal submission to launch wars of conquest.
Let's move to and see how this builds today. Section 5, the modern debate.
So, global data shows a pretty clear decline in liberal democracies worldwide, alongside a rise in strongman leaders. But does that mean fascism is actually back? Interestingly, top historians disagree heavily on this. Take Federico Finkelstein. He looks at modern strongmen and calls them wannabe fascists. His argument is basically that there's no fascism without a full dictatorship. So since a lot of modern leaders still operate within voting systems, even if they secretly want absolute power, they haven't officially crossed that true fascist finish line. On the flip side, Roger Griffin, another leading expert, believes the word fascism itself is actually a distraction today. He argues we're facing something called illiberal democracy, a system where leaders don't completely destroy democracy, but they subtly distort it. They strip away equal rights and civil liberties while keeping the illusion of elections totally intact.
Then you have scholars like William Robinson, who says, hey, we shouldn't get bogged down in whether things look exactly like the 1930s. He warns that the most dangerous fascist ingredient is triangulation, that moment when a ruling class of wealthy elites decides to legitimize ultra-nationalist movements just to protect their own economic interests. Conversely, historian Timothy Snyder argues the deepest red flag is actually in the narrative. He says, fascism begins the moment politics stops being about solving real future problems and instead becomes entirely about a mythic, smooth past and scapegoating a specific group of outsiders for ruining it.
As you can see, there is no universal, unanimous agreement among scholars on this. Whether a modern political movement perfectly fits the 1930s definition of fascism is highly, highly debated. But the real value here isn't in perfectly pinning a historical label on a modern politician. The value is in recognizing these historical ingredients, the warning signs, when they start bubbling up in our modern systems.
So the crucial point is this. For most of human history, large groups have been organized through force, fear, and inequality. Liberal democracy, where your individual rights are actually protected, is a very recent and very fragile experiment. The ugly human instincts for control, submission, and vengeance, they didn't just magically disappear because we got smartphones and the internet. They are always, always bubbling right under the surface.
We are not immune to history. We literally never have been. You don't have to wait for it to be 1933 all over again to notice that something concerning might be happening to a democratic system. So, the question we want to leave you with today isn't about which label to use. It's this. How can we look past the insults and the buzzwords, educate ourselves on the historical patterns of domination, and stay vigilant about the health of our own democracies before it's too late? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.